Hey loves, my name is Amber, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be discussing Sand Dollar Summer by Kimberly K. Jones. Before we get too far into this review, I did want to mention a few trigger warnings that were relevant to the book, including the involvement of a car crash with severe medical aftermath, autism mentioned briefly as a negative trait, facial hair on a woman being pointed out negatively, some slight fat phobia, an absentee father whose absence is brought up regularly throughout the book, some microaggressive racism, and the use of an indigenous slur in an educational context, but it is still featured within the book. So if any of these things are liable to be upsetting or triggering to you, please have extreme discretion while watching the rest of this review or reading the book. But that being said, this is actually a children-aimed book. Like, I would definitely say middle grade, if not a little bit younger. And for some context, I actually bought this book, I believe, when I was in 4th or 5th grade. Like, literally old school, like, Scholastic book fair purchase. And this was actually one of my favorites to read as a kid. I've definitely read it at least a dozen times throughout my life. But that was all definitely when I was a kid, and while it was a regular reread, I haven't read it in about a decade or so. So I was definitely curious to see if it still held up as an adult, like how I felt about it now. And we will definitely get into that. The book follows 12-year-old Lise and her move with her mom and her 5-year-old nonverbal brother Free's move to Fiddle Beach, this small seaside town where her mother grew up. That's less beach vacation and more small town that you either grew up in and never leave, or you leave and never come back to kind of vibes. They spend the summer at this spot after the mother was in an incredibly severe car accident, and they are trying to deal with the rehabilitation and aftermath of the severe medical issues that she faced. Now, like I said, this was definitely a childhood favorite of mine. However, if I'm being entirely honest, I'm not exactly sure what specifically drew my younger self to being so into this book, let alone rereading it so many different times. And like, I definitely want to start by saying, like, it's certainly not a bad book in any way. And I do actually think that there are a lot of positives and a lot of metaphorical symbolism within the book that I do definitely resonate with, and I feel like a lot of people would as well. But I also feel like it is very specific in ways that would almost be alienating to certain groups of people as well. That being said, it is quite ironic to me because I did find a little bit more relatability with some of the literal events that happened within the book as an adult than I did as a kid, because since the last time I had read this book and now, a lot of life events have happened that are actually eerily reminiscent of some of the things that happened within the book. So that was definitely a very surreal kind of experience going back and reading. Almost like it was subconsciously like important to me on a universal level to prepare me for things that I would have to deal with later. And as absolutely crazy as that sounds, it still kind of feels that way. The book was definitely very easy to read, but that is a little bit more expected. One, because I have read it so many times in the past. Well, it did almost feel like reading it for the first time because there was definitely a lot about the book that I had forgotten. And also because, like, I am an adult who's reading a child's book. But that being said, it didn't feel so much like a child's book to where I wouldn't read it again as an adult. And if you hadn't read it before, I would still recommend reading it as an older individual if you had any interest. I don't think that the simpler writing style detracts from the story at all. It does a really decent job at conveying the helplessness that you can feel, especially within childhood, when things are out of your control and you have other people relying on you. I never personally noticed while I had read this book as a kid, but now as an adult seeing it, the depiction of the 5-year-old younger brother definitely feels a bit inauthentic to me, especially after having like interacted with many 5-year-olds. Part of his character is that he is supposed to be advanced for his age, and he's supposed to be this like little individual who's very advanced in certain ways, but it wasn't necessarily done in a believable manner. So, like, if you focus on the fact that he was supposed to be a 5-year-old, that does kind of take you out of the reading a little bit. But if you forget about the direct age range and just think of him like, oh, as like, oh, that is the little brother, like that's the younger brother, it's definitely like a much more readable experience. However, on the flip side of that, I did think that the depiction of the 12-year-old as the narrator of the book was very, very accurate to that age range and a lot of the thoughts and feelings that you have at that age. If maybe a little bit young, like it's definitely an immature 12-year-old depiction, but it does feel accurate and believable nonetheless. The younger brother in the book, Free, is mute, and that is a major plot point throughout the book, particularly in the beginning. We get a lot of background information about that at the start of the book. And I don't necessarily love that there was a conversation that was featured within the book where the mother was talking to a doctor about said nonverbalism, simply because like they don't have any answers for the cause. Like they don't know why as a 5-year-old, like he still isn't talking yet. And the doctor does bring up the possibility of him being on the autism spectrum, and the mother shuts that down and low-key kind of demonizes it and is like, oh, well, that clearly isn't the cause and blah, 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 blah. And like, it just felt a bit icky to me, if I'm being entirely honest. And granted, this was only a paragraph of the book, so it definitely didn't ruin the book or even the chapter by any means. It was just kind of uncomfortable because it didn't need to be demonized in the way that it was. I will give it a slight pass, especially because the book came out in 2006, where it was much more of a conversation in a negative light about children being on the autism spectrum. So I definitely like have to look at it from a societal standpoint at that point in time, but like looking at it currently was not the greatest, especially considering that throughout the entire rest of the book, the brother does display neurodivergent and potentially autistic traits. And I can't tell if that was done in an intentional way to like try to prove a point, or if it just happened to be coincidental or accidental. But I feel like that entire topic could have been done well, but was not necessarily done well in this particular book. And especially in that same vein, there's also a character featured within the book who has Down syndrome. And I don't love the way that they acknowledge this character either, because it is quoted as being like she visually has Down syndrome, which is definitely an outdated, but like granted still very prevalent stereotype. And it's just not the ideal way to present neurodivergent characters. Granted, it didn't feel hostile, and if anything, like I could definitely hear the argument that it's more so the characterization of the age range of people who are talking about it, especially, you know, like the comment about her like visually having Down syndrome is made by a 12-year-old. So like it could be more so a characterization of children just being like blunt and unsympathetic, but I still didn't necessarily love it because I couldn't specifically tell if it was trying to be a characterization of the age range of the narrator. I'll be honest, there's definitely several points throughout the book where I can't tell what is specifically meant to be like character specific points versus what is made from the misunderstandings or just the shortfallings of the author trying to explain them. Building off of that point, we do have a native character who is featured within the book, who is referred to by certain characters within the book in a very like low-key racist and microaggressive kind of way. And that I do feel like was mostly supposed to be a characterization of racist and like small town kids who weren't more educated and who were just taking the opinions of their parents, who were originally, you know, racist and microaggressive as well. But there were definitely certain ways about how this particular character was handled that could have been done better as well. It wasn't bad per se, it was just very, very stereotyped in the way that there's a lot of media that has like the token like native indigenous character who is mostly there to provide like educational insight and life lessons to the younger white protagonist. There's definitely a ton of media that falls into that, and this book is no exception. So that could have been done a little bit better, but I also kind of understand why they went so basic and stereotypical with it for the like short span of the book and the just age range that it was aimed at. Like, I understand why they were so basic and blunt about a lot of the things. I just don't love that they were, because I feel like it would have been more beneficial had they developed on a lot of these points and themes a little bit more versus just making them more basic and stereotyped. And that goes for like several things throughout the book, not just the indigenous character, but that character in particular is something that I would have liked to have seen a little bit more development in. I will have to say, as a positive of the book, I did like seeing a family represented that didn't have both parents in the household, but they also didn't make part of the storyline this whole like tragic backstory kind of plot. Like, it wasn't like there was a death or anything. Like, it wasn't this, you know, traumatic thing. It just so happened that like the father of the family was gone. And while it was mentioned frequently throughout the book, like, it was kind of just waved off, like, we're not going to make this a point to indulge in like other people trying to be gossipy and find out information, because that is a very, very realistic scenario for a lot of different families, and we don't get to see that represented too much. You know, normally there's always like, if it's ever brought up that there is a family that has, you know, one of the nuclear family members missing, like, it's always a point to be like, oh, like, why are they missing? You know, there's either a death or, you know, tragic abandonment or different things, where it's just like, no, like, he's just gone and they don't care, you know, like, they're better without. And that's really, really nice to see represented, because it's so rare to see it represented. But it was also nice to see that within that same theme and vein, we did have an adult male within the story who was kind of trying to come in almost as a replacement type of father figure. But that entire storyline definitely felt very organic. And it was really actually nice to see, you know, this guy's like genuine attempts at relating to the kids and becoming a part of this family's life, instead of just like, okay, for context within the story, it was like the mother's high school sweetheart happened to run into this family while they're in this town that she had grown up in. And so he starts coming around and they start kind of rebuilding and rekindling this relationship. But now this woman obviously has two kids. Like, they're not teenagers anymore. They can't just start where they left off. There's these two kids that he has to try and build a relationship with. And it's actually kind of nice to see how genuine he is in his attempts to do so, but how a lot of those aren't necessarily successful. Like, a lot of things go wrong with that, but they still continue trying. And there's a lot of character, I feel like, development and growth potential within that. Another thing that I did really like about the story was the symbolism of the sand dollar that was featured throughout, and how often like larger sand dollars will either get lost in the tides, or if they do show up on shore, they'll be broken and shattered and end up getting lost, and they're not whole and complete. Whereas very often these little teeny tiny itty bitty, like, delicate, fragile seeming sand dollars will arrive on shore like perfectly unscathed and just like in these perfect little spots that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be. And I feel like that just their use of that kind of metaphor and symbolism throughout the book was fairly well done, especially in direct metaphorical reference to the family that's featured. We have this mother who's, you know, the adult, she's supposed to be this strong, unbreakable one who is broken and who gets very lost and is trying to find herself and her way home. Whereas we have these two kids, particularly Lise, as she is the narrator of the story, come in and just these little tiny, fragile, delicate sand dollars, if you will, who are kind of just thrown wherever the tide takes them, but they still are able to land on their feet and find their way. I feel like it was done fairly well, particularly for a children's story. So overall, I would definitely say that it is a decent book, and I'd even go so far as to say it's a good book. I don't know how many more times in my life I'll ever end up rereading it, but it was a book that was so near and dear to my heart for so long. It's definitely one that'll be like a lifelong spot on my shelf. But I definitely think the younger you are, the more you would get out of it, whereas if you happen to be older at this point in time, you may have missed the ideal kind of timeline for you to have read it and gotten the most out of it. There are certainly many things that the book could have done a little bit differently and a little bit better, but overall I don't think they were done in ways that are entirely damaging to the narrative either. It's mostly gonna come down to a personal preference and how you feel about how certain topics and situations are handled. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I had a blast hanging out with y'all. Peace.